All right. Am I on here? Oh, okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Uncommon Core lecture, the causes and consequences of the Ukraine crisis. My name is Michael Volchak. I attended the university from 1986 to 1991. I got a bachelor's in political science and a master's in international relations. Professor Mearsheimer was a tremendous influence on my life, completely revolutionizing my worldview, changed how I looked at international relations, politics, just everything. In fact, he was such a big influence on my life that, when I went home for the summer between one of the school years, leaving my college girlfriend here, she gave me a little keepsake picture book, and she said, "Here, to remember the people you love." And inside was a picture of her on the right and a picture of Professor Mearsheimer on the left. That's a true story. When I was here, the two biggest things that for me were military affairs and the Model United Nations of the University of Chicago, the student organization that I co-founded in 1988. And at that time, I discovered that you need a faculty advisor in order to have a registered student organization. So, of course, I thought for about 2 seconds, and then I went to see Professor Mearsheimer. And I'm not sure if he remembers this, but I asked him, "Will you be our faculty advisor?" And he said, "I will sign the piece of paper if I never have to do anything else after that." So I had found my faculty advisor. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Professor of Political Science, Professor John J. Mearsheimer.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thanks all for coming out to hear me talk. The subject I want to talk about is the causes and consequences of the Ukraine crisis, which of course has been in the news in a really big way since February 2014. And indeed, there was a big story on the civil war in eastern Ukraine in the newspapers this morning. The outline I'd like to follow is I'd just like to make a number of preliminary comments to give you some background on this crisis. Then I'd like to give you my thinking on what caused the crisis. Then tell you why I think the conventional wisdom is wrong. Talk a little bit about the West's response so far to the crisis, which is just, in my opinion, making a bad situation worse. And tell you what I think should be done. And then finally wrap up with some discussion of the consequences. So let me start with some preliminary comments. First, with regard to America's core strategic interests. For me, core strategic interests are areas of the world where you're willing to fight and die. And in my opinion, outside of the Western Hemisphere, which is of enormous strategic importance to us, there are only 3 areas of the world that really matter. 1 is Europe, 2 is Northeast Asia, and 3 is the Persian Gulf. And it's very important to understand that since this country got its independence in 1783, Europe has been the most important area of the world. Even though the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor, we had a Europe first policy going into the war, and we had a Europe first policy throughout the war. And it's in large part because the great powers in Europe are more important than the great powers in Northeast Asia over time. Of course, the Persian Gulf was an important area because that's where the oil is. And oil is a critical resource that matters greatly in the international system. So those are the 3 most important areas outside the Western Hemisphere. And again, since the beginning of this country, Europe has been number 1. You want to understand that we're undergoing a fundamental shift of great importance. Asia, because of the rise of China, is going to be the most important area of the world for the United States. The Persian Gulf, because it's inextricably linked with Asia. Oil flowing to India, oil flowing to China. The Persian Gulf will be number 2. And Europe will be a distant 3. We're basically leaving Europe in the rearview mirror. And of course, you want to keep this in mind because the Ukraine crisis is in Europe and it involves NATO. how to think about the geography of Europe. This is
Crest,
a
and
simple,
5 left,
if not
into
simplistic
caution,
way of
3
thinking
right,
about it. But
tightness
here's a
of a
map.
crest.
You can see where Ukraine
Into
is.
slow,
See where
5 left
Poland
long of
is,
a crest,
see where
30,
Russia
turn
is.
unseen,
The way I
3
think
right
about
long,
European
tightens
security
narrow,
is there's France, Germany, Poland,
opens long of a
Ukraine,
crest into
and Russia.
caution narrow,
Of course, we're
3
moving
left of a
from
crest.
west to east. These are the big kahunas. These are the big
6
countries
right.
that matter.
And
And of course, the
3
two
left
countries
long,
that matter the most historically are Germany and
into
Russia,
4 right of a
or
crest.
for most of the 20th century, Germany and the Soviet Union. And I put them in red because, as you well know,
Into slow
both
4
Germany
left long,
and the Soviet
tightens,
Union
turn square
fought
left,
bitter wars
opens
in
long,
Poland, in Ukraine, and we could add in Belarus
right.
as well,
opens of a
if
crest,
need be.
30,
But as we go along here, you want to keep in mind
5 left of a
that
jump,
Ukraine is right next to
30,
Russia,
6
and
right of a crest,
Poland
30,
is right next
slow
to
4 left
Ukraine.
long, tightens
And then
turn
out
2,
further west is Germany and France. Take this
into
a
turn
step further.
right, around
This is the
bounds.
ethnic breakdown of Ukraine.
50
I'm
over
going to show you a
crest.
number of maps, all of which are
6
designed
left.
to show you that Ukraine is a
Into 5
badly
right
divided
long,
country.
opens
And
over
what's
crest,
taking place
50.
inside Ukraine today is in good part a civil war. And
4 right of
to
a
that
jump,
extent, it
into
doesn't have
don't
that
cut,
much to
4
do with
left
what the
long,
Russians or the West are doing there.
opens of a
And
crest,
as you can
30,
see
turn
in red,
hairpin left,
are mostly Ukrainian-speaking people. And then as you move
And
further east,
flat,
you're
6
talking
right
about
long,
lots of Russians
130.
and certainly lots of Russian speakers. This is the Ukraine
Keep middle of a
election of
crest.
2004. This is
Into
the
6
election
right.
in the wake of the
And keep
famous
right over
Orange
200.
Revolution, which I'll talk more about. As you can see, the country is badly
4 right,
divided
very long, tightens
between the
turn,
east and the
hairpin right.
west. The Russian speakers in the east and Ukrainian speakers in
Into
the
6
west.
left long,
This is the 2010
Into 5 right
election, which resulted in
Into
Yanukovych
6
getting
left
elected.
of a
I'll talk
crest.
about President Yanukovych
80.
as we go along. He was elected in 2010. And you can see there the voting patterns in the 2010 election
left of a crest.
look a lot like the voting
Into 6
patterns in
right.
the 2004
100.
election.
6
And then
left,
these are two recent surveys that
120.
came out from the
6 left
International
of a crest.
Republican
Into
Institute
caution,
that's
4
here
right long,
in the United
tightens.
States. This one says if
Into 6
Ukraine
left,
could enter
extra,
only one
extra long.
international economic union,
Into
which of the
6 right,
following should
extra,
it be?
extra long,
And of course,
tightness
the blue is
5,
the EU, and the light blue
100.
is the customs union.
5 left long,
Or actually, the red is the
150.
customs union of Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And
5 left of a crest,
the cities up at the top
140,
are in western
turn unseen,
Ukraine,
1
and the
right.
cities down on the bottom are in eastern Ukraine. So you can see
Opens
very
through narrow
clearly that
gate.
people in the west would like to join
30.
the EU. People in the east have little interest in joining the EU. Those are the EU
Turn
numbers.
1
Here are
left,
the NATO
opens
numbers.
through narrow gate,
I mean, these two charts look
120.
virtually the same.
Cut 6
But
left
all
of
of
a
this
dip,
tells you that you have a badly divided country.
into 5 right of a
The
crest,
conflict
extra,
between the West and
extra
Russia
long,
over
opens of
Ukraine
a crest,
played out in
50.
the context of this situation. This is a simple little view graph.
Keep flat middle of a crest,
It shows Europe's
100.
dependent on Russian
Keep left of
gas.
a crest, jump,
It's quite
120.
clear from that view graph that
Crest,
many
jump,
of the countries in
and
Eastern
5
Europe
right.
and even countries
Just
like
6
Germany
left,
are
don't
heavily
cut.
dependent on Russian
100.
natural gas.
Keep middle of a crest.
Of course, that
big
gives the
jump,
Russians
40.
lots of political
4 left
leverage in
long,
this crisis, and it
opens.
makes it very difficult
Into
for
6
us
right.
to put
70.
pressure on the Russians. Okay, those are just a number of preliminary comments I wanted to throw out just to set this up.
Opens.
Let's talk
Into
about
4
the
left
causes
long,
of the conflict.
30.
I think if you're going to talk about the causes of the conflict, you have to come at it
6
from
right,
3
opens
different
long,
perspectives.
into
First of
slow,
all, you have
6
to
left.
ask, what are the deep causes
6
of
right
the
long,
crisis?
tightens turn,
What are the
3 long.
structural factors that underpin this conflict?
Opens,
Then you have to talk
30.
about the precipitating causes, because the
right long,
crisis broke out
opens,
on February
30,
22nd, 2014.
long, tightens,
Things were not
50,
terrible until February
right
22nd,
tightens.
2014. And that's when everything went to hell in a
left,
handbasket.
very long,
And the question is, what
tightens,
caused
4
it
cut.
then? If If you focus on deep
Five right
causes,
of a
it can't
crest,
tell you
into
why
five
something
left
happened in
long, caution,
February
don't cut to a
2014.
finish,
But the
to stop.
precipitating causes are designed to get at that. And then what we want to talk about is the Russian reaction. Why the Russians
Just
did what they
fastest
did
time in that stage.
with regard to Crimea, with regard to eastern Ukraine. We want to talk about exactly what they did and then why they did it. So let's start with the deep causes. My argument is that the West is principally responsible for this mess, not the Russians. This, of course, is not the conventional wisdom in the United States. And in fact, except for Steve Cohen, who's now at Princeton, now at NYU, he used to be at Princeton, Henry Kissinger, and maybe a handful of other people, there are not many people who agree with me.
Starts 30,
But
six
I
right
think
of
the
a crest,
facts are
like
quite
four,
clear on this.
into five left,
The
and
West
cut
is
five right
responsible.
opens long.
And my aim is that the
Five,
main deep causes,
30,
the aim of the United States
six
and
right
its
of a
European
crest, long tightens
allies,
four,
to peel Ukraine
into
away
five
from
left,
Russia's orbit
into cut,
and
five
incorporate
right,
it
opens
into the
long,
West.
30,
Our basic goal has been to
four
make
left long,
Ukraine
opens
a
30,
Western
four left,
bulwark on Russia's border. And Russia says, this ain't happening, period,
and
end of
five
story.
left, extra
And
long
we
of a
will do
crest, tightens
everything we
turn,
can
three left,
to make sure it does not happen.
opens,
That's the deep cause. Now,
and
take it a
six
step
left,
further. There are three
into
key
five
elements
right,
in our strategy.
30,
The first is NATO
six
expansion,
left long,
and in many
30,
ways the most important.
four right
And I'll
long,
talk in some detail about that in a second. But as you all know, since the
opens
Cold War ended,
30,
starting with the Clinton administration,
four
we have
left
been
long,
moving NATO eastward
opens
toward Russia's border.
50,
And the Russians have said, this is an
five
absolute
left,
no-no. And I'll walk you through the story in a minute.
30,
Second is EU
five
expansion.
right long, tightens
EU
four,
expansion is all about
80.
integrating Ukraine
Keep middle of a crest,
economically
big
into the
jump.
West. The way
To
we
long
are in the
crest,
process of
into six right,
integrating
extra
Poland,
long,
the Czech
into
Republic,
six left, opens
Slovakia,
of
the
a crest
Baltic
jump,
states
180,
into the West. And of course, we're doing that with NATO as well.
six right of a
These
crest,
are two sets of institutions,
120,
NATO, military institution, the
middle
EU,
of a
an
crest
economic
jump,
institution.
50, four left of a
And the
crest,
idea, again,
extra long,
is to
tightens
take
of a
Ukraine,
crest,
peel it away from Russia, make it part of the West. The third part of the story
six right of a
is
crest long,
fostering an orange
120,
revolution
through
This is
narrow
all about
gate,
promoting
turn,
democracy.
one right,
in Ukraine and in other
opens
places.
through narrow
As you
gate,
all know, the United States
turn
runs around the
left,
world trying to topple
opens
regimes and put in their place
200.
democratically elected regimes. And for almost all of
Four
you,
right,
me included,
extra long,
it's hard to be
opens
against promoting
80.
democracy. We all love democracy. But if you're Vladimir Putin, or if
three
you're
left long,
part of the leadership in Beijing,
100,
when the United States talks about democracy
six
promotion,
right,
that means
120,
toppling your regime.
four left long,
And you won't be
opens
surprised to hear
100,
this. They don't like that in Beijing, and they don't like that in Moscow.
flat right of a crest,
They do not like that.
120,
The Chinese believe that we're behind
keep left into
the
don't
protests
cut,
in Hong
four
Kong.
right,
You go to Beijing, you talk to Chinese
100.
elites. The idea that
Six
we're
right long,
promoting democracy
50.
around the world, and especially in East Asia,
five left
just
long,
drives
don't
them
cut,
crazy. Because
slow
they think they're in
30.
the crosshairs. And you know what? They are in
six
the
right
crosshairs.
into turn unseen,
Because our
heavy
basic
left,
strategy is to topple regimes all over the world. Not
Opens
simply because we
six
like
long.
democracy, but because we believe
150.
that whoever gets elected will be pro-Western. So we're killing two birds with one stone. We're promoting democracy
left.
and getting leaders who are pro-American.
150,
But again, you can see the strategy here. NATO expansion, EU expansion,
caution,
and
slow,
promoting
don't cut, six left long,
democracy.
30, turn unseen,
Say a
hairpin
bit more
right,
about NATO expansion because it's so important. NATO expansion took
120,
place in two tranches.
six right long,
The first one was in
tightens
1999. That's when you get Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary incorporated into
five,
NATO.
to four left of a crest,
The
jump,
second big tranche was in
100 of a crest,
2004.
four left long,
And that's when
and
the
slow.
Baltic states,
Keep
you
right
can
of a
see
100,
Estonia,
turn,
Latvia, and
one left,
Lithuania up
don't
top,
cut,
Romania, Bulgaria, these are the light brown countries.
and sudden,
That's the second tranche
turn,
of NATO
four right
expansion.
long, opens of a
Now,
crest,
the
turn
Soviets
crest,
made it clear from the
and six left of a
mid-1990s they were
crest.
adamantly opposed to NATO expansion. But number one, they were too
Into
weak
6
to
right
do
over
anything
jump.
about it. And
Caution,
two, it
keep right of
didn't
a crest into
involve
4
the
left.
states that were right on their border. I mean, there's
And
no question,
slow,
as you can
4
see from
right
the
long,
map, that
tightens turn
Latvia
1,
and Estonia are on
30.
Russia's border, and Lithuania
4 left of a crest.
as well.
Into
if you
4
wanna
right,
include that
very
little
long
enclave
tightens.
between Poland
Into cut
and
5
Lithuania.
left.
But the fact is, these were very small states. It was early in the game, and the
Into
Russians
4
were
right,
willing to
tightens
live
of a
with it.
crest, jump.
But then the big trouble starts. And it comes
Opens to
in the
crest and
famous
4 left.
Bucharest
tightens
Summit,
3 extra
NATO's
long.
Bucharest
Don't
Summit
cut of a junction.
in April 2008, where at the end of the summit,
6 right of a crest.
a declaration
extra long.
is issued which says
Into
NATO
4 left of a
welcomes
crest.
Ukraine's
30.
and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic
6 right long
aspirations
of a
for
crest.
membership
Jump
in NATO.
maybe to
We agreed
crest.
today
Into 5
that
right,
these
extra long.
countries will
Tightens.
become members of NATO.
Keep middle of a crest
So,
and don't cut
Soviets,
4
the
right.
Russians made this
Opens.
perfectly clear.
80
This
of a
was
crest.
unacceptable.
And 4
Russia's
left long,
deputy foreign
tightens 3
minister
of a
said
junction.
Georgia's
50.
and Ukraine's membership in the alliance is a huge strategic mistake which will have most serious consequences for
6 left,
pan-European security.
extra long.
Putin himself said Georgia
Into
and
4 right
Ukraine
long.
becoming part of NATO
Into
is
6
a
left,
direct threat
extra long of a
to
crest.
Russia.
Opens extra long.
You all remember that there was a war between Russia and Georgia in August
30.
2008.
5 right long.
That
tightens
war
4.
was a consequence of this, because the
Into 4
Georgians
left long,
thought
past
we were
junction.
sending them a
Opens
signal
5 left,
that they could
extra
get
long of a
uppity with
crest.
the Russians,
200.
and we would back them because they were going to become part of NATO. That's not what happened. And you know what happened. The Russians clobbered the Georgians,
5
and
right of a
Georgia is
crest,
in deep
jump
trouble
long,
today
tightens.
because it thought it could become part of NATO. So
Into
you want to
5
remember
left
that
long of a
April
crest,
2008
40.
summit, very
Turn
important. That
unseen,
declaration,
2 right long.
very important. And then what happens is you have a war.
Opens.
Those are the deep causes, those
200.
three strategies. NATO expansion,
over
EU
narrow
expansion,
bridge
and
past
promoting
Bales.
democracy.
20. Turn
What
late,
about the
hairpin
precipitating
left, around
cause?
Bale.
Key events
Into
leading
5
up
right,
to the coup.
extra long.
It's the coup of
Into
February
cut,
22nd,
left.
2014, that's of enormous importance. That's what really throws the crisis into gear. Just think about that
And
word, coup.
6 right long.
Orange
Water
Revolution,
splash. 80.
promoting democracy. The coup, February 22nd, 2014.
Keep middle of a crest.
question is what
through
causes
narrow
the
gate.
coup?
20.
It all
cut,
starts
6
in
left.
November of 2013. At that point,
30.
Yanukovych, President Yanukovych,
6
who's
right of a
the
crest
head
long.
of Ukraine,
80.
is negotiating with the EU
6 left.
to
Extra long.
form an
tightens
association
cut 3.
agreement that brings the EU and Ukraine
right of a
much
crest.
closer together. It's a
40.
step in the direction of incorporating Ukraine into the European Union, or to put it in slightly
6 right of a
different
crest.
terms, incorporating Ukraine into
Into
the
5
West.
left.
The
Opens
Russians make
middle
it
of a
clear that
crest.
this is unacceptable.
80.
Russians are willing to do a deal that
6
involves
left,
the EU,
6
Russia,
right,
the
very
IMF,
long,
and Ukraine.
over
But
finish.
the idea that Ukraine is
Just
going to do a
stop.
deal exclusively
Well
with the EU and the Russians are going to be left out in the cold is not something
just
that
did the
Putin is willing
fastest
to
time on that
countenance.
stage.
He puts significant pressure on the Ukrainians. He offers them a terrific deal. And as you can imagine, the EU is not offering Ukraine a particularly good deal because you know how much corruption there is in Ukraine. And the EU wants Ukraine to eliminate that corruption, which the Ukrainians really don't want to do. So what Putin does is not only make it clear that that deal is not going to happen, but he often just offers a sweetheart deal of his own. So Yanukovych, on November 21st, says no to
Starts
the
50.
EU.
6 left of a
This
crest.
leads
6 right
to
of
a
crest.
series
Extra
of
long,
protests.
30. Good luck.
The Ukrainian government, truth be told,
5.
under Yanukovych,
50.
overreacts
6
to the
left of a
protests,
crest.
which causes them
Into
to
6 right
spiral
of a
out of
crest.
control.
Extra long.
And
30.
in January of 2014, you can see there, January
right.
22nd,
Into
2014,
6 left of a
you have your
crest.
first two
Extra
deaths
long.
in the protests.
Tightens
These are the
3 of a
Maidan
crest.
protests. And then, in the February 18th through February 20th time period,
Into
lots
cut.
of
3
people
right
died.
long.
It's really
Opens
messy.
6
And what
of a
happens
crest.
is that a number of
30.
European foreign ministers, the German foreign minister, French foreign
Six
minister,
left of a
they
crest
fly
long.
to Kiev, and a deal is worked out
Caution,
to
30,
have
turn
elections
4 right through very
that
narrow
will,
gate.
in effect, remove
And
Yanukovych
crest to
from
6
power.
right long, water splash, 30.
But the protesters
For
refused
left of a
to accept
crest.
the deal. And
Into cut
there are
4 right long.
significant fascist elements among the
Into cut
protesters
5
who are
left.
armed.
Slow 30,
right?
turn
There's
cut 4
killing
left. Into
on the
hairpin right,
Maidan.
around Bales.
And as a result, Yanukovych flees for his life
50.
to Russia. And this all
6
happens
left, 50.
on February 22nd.
6 left, 120 over narrow bridge. 6 left long, tightens don't cut, turn 3.
Did I not have that slide on? I'm sorry.
30.
One of the problems with this lecture,
Four right of a
can't
crest
see.
long.
I'm sorry, that's the slide that has
left long of a
all the
crest.
key events. Oh, gosh.
100.
Sorry. I have 2 slides up here, so I lost track of the fact.
6 right.
So here are the
extra
key
long,
events after the
tightens
coup.
5 over
On
crest.
February 23rd,
Extra,
Parliament
extra
votes to
long,
repeal minority
tightens
language
3.
laws in the East. This is basically the Russian language.
30.
And then on February 27th, Russian
Left
units
over
begin
crest long.
seizing checkpoints in the Crimea. On the 28th,
Right of a
additional
crest,
Russian
tightens
forces
30.
begin moving into the Crimea. The Russians didn't conquer
right of
or
a
invade
bump,
Crimea.
a sign,
Excuse me, the Russians didn't
for
invade
left.
Crimea. They were already there because they had a
Into 5
leasing
right long.
agreement. It was a naval
80.
base at Sevastopol,
Turn unseen,
and the
3
Russians
right
were
long,
leasing that
opens of a
naval
crest,
base from
and crest,
Ukraine. So
50.
they had military forces there. So when it says Russian units begin seizing checkpoints on the
Crest,
27th,
left
those
long,
were Russian
tightens,
units
don't
that were
cut.
already there.
Opens of
Then
a crest.
additional Russian forces begin moving in on the 28th.
Into 6 left of
And
a
then
crest.
on the 6th, the
50.
16th, and the 18th, you have a scenario, you have a handful of events that lead
Crest,
to Russia
and 5 left.
incorporating
Into caution,
Crimea.
3 right.
And
Tightens
then,
of a
of course,
crest.
shortly after that,
Into slow.
conflict
5 left long
breaks
of a crest,
out
30,
in
turn
eastern
unseen,
Ukraine.
3 right long.
and although we do
tightens
not have a
narrow,
lot of hard evidence that the Russians are physically involved in eastern Ukraine,
opens long
I
of a
think it's
crest
quite
into
clear
caution
that
narrow,
they are
3 left
physically
of a crest.
involved, that there are Russian troops there. How many is very hard to tell from the outside.
Into 6
And
right.
I think it's very
And
clear that the Russian government
left long.
is going to great
Into 4
lengths
right of a
to make
crest.
sure that
Into
those
slow 4 left
pro-Russian
long,
forces
tightens turn
in
square
eastern
left.
Ukraine
Opens long
are capable
and 4 right.
of
Opens of a crest, 30.
maintaining a certain amount of independence, and I'll talk more about it
5 left of a jump,
in a second.
30.
Okay,
6
understanding
right of a crest,
the
30.
Russian response.
Slow 4 left long, tightens turn 2.
What is the Russian response? 2 parts. First is
It's a turn,
they
one
took
right,
Crimea
around
and they're not
Bales.
giving it back. Crimea is gone.
50 over crest.
Second is what they're doing
6 left.
is not trying
Into
to
5
conquer
right long.
Ukraine. There are many
Opens of a
people who say
crest,
the Russians are going
50.
to go on a rampage, they're going to try and reestablish the Soviet Union or a greater Russia, and
right
so
of a
forth and
jumps
so
into
on.
don't cut, 4 left long.
That's not going to happen. Putin is much too smart for that. You remember what happened when the Russians
Opens of a
invaded
crest, 30,
Afghanistan?
turn
You
late,
remember what happened
happy
when we
left.
invaded Afghanistan? You remember what happened when we invaded Iraq?
And
You remember what happened when the
flat,
Israelis
6
invaded
right long.
southern Lebanon? You want to stay out of these
130.
places. In fact, if you really want to wreck Russia, what you should do is encourage it to try and conquer Ukraine.
Keep middle of a
Putin,
crest
again,
into
is
6
much
right
too
over
smart to do
finish.
that. What Putin is
100
doing
to
is
stop.
he's basically in the process of wrecking Ukraine, and he's telling the West in very simple terms, you have 2 choices. You either back off, right, and we go back to the status quo ante before February 22nd,
That felt good,
2014,
but let's check
where
the
Ukraine
times.
is a buffer state, or you continue to play these games where you try and take Ukraine and make it a Western bastion on our doorstep, in which case we'll wreck the country. And they are, of course, now in the process of wrecking it, right? And they're going to keep this conflict going for as long as they have to. That's the basic game here. Again, 2 steps. 1, took Crimea. No way they're going to ever let Crimea become a NATO base. And remember, the name of the game here is to make Ukraine part of NATO. Not happening. And they're not getting Crimea. We've taken
30,
Crimea,
6
we're
right
keeping
of a
it.
crest
Number
long,
1.
left
And
4,
number 2,
into
you want
5
frozen
left, into cut
conflict,
5
or
right
you
over
want to
as
wreck
well.
Ukraine
Good luck.
so that it can't become part of the
5,
West.
30.
Question number
6
2
right of a
here is
crest
what
long, tightens
motivates
4.
this. motivates this
into
is that
5
Russia's
left,
a great power.
into cut,
It has
5 right,
absolutely no
opens
interest
long,
in
30,
allowing the United States and its allies to take
Four left
a big
long,
piece of real
opens
estate
30,
of great
four
strategic
left.
importance on its western border and incorporate it into the West.
and
This
5
should
left,
be hardly
extra long over
surprising
crest,
to the United
tightens
States
turn,
of America.
3 left,
As all of you know, we have a Monroe
Opens.
Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine basically says that
And
the Western
6 left.
Hemisphere is our backyard, and nobody
into 5 right,
from a distant
30,
region is allowed to move military forces into the Western
6 left
Hemisphere.
long,
I can tell from
30,
looking at the audience
four
that most
right
of you are
long.
old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis like I am. You remember how we went
Opens
stark raving
30,
crazy at the idea of the Soviets
four
putting
left
military
long.
forces in Cuba?
Opens
This is unacceptable.
50,
Nobody puts military
five left.
forces in the Western Hemisphere. That's what the Monroe Doctrine is all
30,
about. Can you imagine 20
right
years
long,
from now a powerful
tightens
China
4,
forming a military alliance with Canada and
middle
Mexico
of a crest,
and
and
moving
big jump
Chinese military
to long
forces onto
crest,
Canadian
into 6 right,
and
extra
Mexican
long,
soil,
into 6
and us
left, opens
just
of a crest, jump,
standing there and saying,
180,
this is no problem. We're all 21st century
6
people
right of a crest,
worrying
jump,
about Chinese forces
120,
there is what 19th century people like
keep middle
Vladimir
of a crest,
Putin
jump,
worry about.
50, 4 left
Of course,
of a
that's
crest,
not going to
extra
happen.
long,
We're going to
tightens,
maintain the
of a
Monroe
crest,
Doctrine with regard to China just as we did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So
6 right
nobody
of a
should be
crest long,
surprised that the
120,
Russians
through narrow
were
gate,
apoplectic
turn,
about the
one
idea
right.
of us putting
Opens
Ukraine
through narrow gate,
on the western side of the
turn,
ledger.
1 left,
And by the way, they told us, I gave you the quotes,
opens
in the wake of
200,
the Bucharest summit. I told you what happened in August 2008 with the Georgia
right,
War.
extra long,
The precedents were there.
opens
The rhetoric was
80.
there. They told us. We did not stop our efforts to make Ukraine part of
3 left long,
the West.
100,
And the Russians responded. Was it surprising?
6 right,
For some reason,
120,
President Obama and virtually
Four
all
left
the
long,
elites in the West were
opens
surprised.
100,
I guess this is because they're 21st century people, right? And they think that balance of power politics
right of a
doesn't matter
crest,
anymore.
120,
If you think these people in Washington and most Americans are having trouble dealing
keep
with the
left into
Russians,
don't cut, 4 right,
you can't believe how much trouble we're going to have with the
100.
Chinese. I'm very popular in
right
China.
long.
I go to China quite often. And I usually start my talks by saying
left long,
it's good to
don't
be
cut.
back among my people.
slow 30,
Because when I'm in China, I'm intellectually much more at home
6
there
right
than
into
I am in
turn,
Washington.
unseen, happy
Because
left.
in Beijing, much like in Moscow, you're dealing with 19th
Opens
century people
6
like me.
long.
Whereas in Washington, you're dealing with 21st century people.
150,
I think the Chinese are going to eat our lunch. Right? Talk a bit about the conventional
6
wisdom.
left, opens,
Conventional wisdom is
150.
that Putin is the main cause of the crisis. Some say he's either crazy or
caution,
irrational.
slow,
Angela
don't
Merkel
cut, 6
was
left long,
making this
30,
argument for a
turn
while.
unseen, happy
He's
right.
bent on creating a greater Russia, and he bears marked resemblance to Adolf Hitler. Say a few
120,
words about each of these. I know a
6
great
right
deal about
long,
Adolf
tightens
Hitler. I've
5.
written and I teach extensively on Nazi Germany's
Into 4
behavior in
left
the
of a
30s
crest,
and during
jump.
World War II. The idea that he bears any
100 of a
resemblance
crest.
to Adolf Hitler is
Finish,
laughable in the
into
extreme.
4 left
It's hard
long,
to believe that serious
50
people make
to
that
stop.
argument. The idea that he's bent on creating a greater Russia, I think if he could do it, he'd do it. He can't do it.
How did the
Russia's
car
a
feel in that
declining
stage?
great power.
Do you
And
want
as
to
I
make
said
any
to you
setup
before,
changes
if
at
they
the
were
next
trying
service?
to create a greater Russia by invading Ukraine and by invading the Baltic states, they'd be jumping into the briar patch. In fact, again, if you want to wreck Russia, what you should do is tell them to try and create a greater Russia. It will lead to no end of trouble. I think Putin is much too smart for that, and he is in the process of wrecking Ukraine. I want to make that clear. And he's wrecking Ukraine because he's basically saying to the West, you can't have it, and I'll wreck it before you take it.
Starts 5 right
Is he
long,
crazy or
bit of a
irrational? I
crest,
don't
50.
think so.
Good luck.
I think he's very strategic,
5,
and I don't think he's the
5
main
right
cause
long,
of the crisis. as
opens
I
of a
said
crest,
to you.
50.
Another set of arguments associated with the conventional
4
wisdom.
right of a jump.
This is that the United States is a benign hegemon seeking to promote European stability, seeking to promote stability in Asia,
Opens
all
of
over
a
the
crest,
globe,
30,
and so forth
turn
and so
late,
on.
hairpin left.
There's some countries like Japan and Germany, for sure, Poland, who view
and
the United States
flat,
as a benign
6 right
hegemon.
long.
There are many countries out there who do not.
130.
Iran is one, China's another, and Russia's a third. They just don't see it that
Keep
way.
middle of a crest.
And because they don't see
Into
it that
6
way, you
right.
should understand that
And
when you
keep right
take
over
measures,
200.
you meaning the United States, that you think are going to be interpreted
4
as
right.
benign,
Very long.
the
Tightens
other
turn,
side will
hairpin
not
right.
see them that way. They will see them as threatening. This gets back to my point about democracy promotion.
Into
We
6
believe
left long.
democracy promotion is an unalloyed good.
Into
We
5
can't
right
understand
long.
why people like Putin and the leaders in
Into 6 left of a
Beijing don't
crest.
understand this, but they don't
80.
understand it. And if you don't recognize what other people think, you're incapable of putting yourself in their shoes. You're going to
Don't
get yourself
cut.
into a heck
5
of a lot of
left of a
trouble.
crest.
And of course,
Into
that's
6 right.
exactly what happened here.
100.
And then another
6
argument is
left.
that
120.
Putin's behavior proves that it was wise to expand NATO
6 left
eastward
of a crest.
to
Into
try
caution,
to
4 right
include
long.
Ukraine
Tightens.
and Georgia. Right?
Into 6 left.
What's very
extra,
interesting
extra
is
long.
that there is no evidence
Into 6
that
right.
we thought
extra,
Putin
extra long.
was
Tightens
aggressive
5.
before the crisis. There's no evidence that we thought that.
100.
There's no evidence that
5
we were
left long,
talking
150.
about expanding NATO because we had to contain the Russians. Because again,
left of
NATO
a crest,
expansion was driven by
140,
21st century men and
turn
women.
unseen,
They believed
1
balance of
right.
power politics is dead. That's what happened here. Do you understand?
Opens through
Putin is a
narrow
19th
gate.
century man. Right?
30,
He does view the world
turn
of balance of
1
power
left,
in terms of
opens
balance
through
of power
narrow
politics,
gate.
as do we when it comes to the Monroe Doctrine and the Western
120,
Hemisphere. But in this case, in the
cut
case of
6
Europe,
left
we were
of a
thinking
dip.
like 21st century men and women. And we thought that we could just drive
Into
right up
5
to his
right of a
doorstep
crest.
and it wouldn't matter.
Extra, extra long.
We
Opens of a
did
crest.
not think
50.
that Russia was aggressive. What happened here is that after the crisis broke
Keep
out
flat,
on
middle of a
February
crest,
22nd,
100.
we then
Keep
decided
left of a crest,
that
jump.
Russia was aggressive.
120.
We then decided that Russia
Crest,
was bent
jump.
on creating a greater
And 5
Russia.
right.
It was after the fact.
Into 6 left.
By the way, this
Don't
is
cut.
why President Obama and
100.
virtually all of
Keep middle of
Washington
a crest.
was caught
Big
with their
jump.
pants down when
40.
this crisis broke out after February
left long.
22nd, because they did
Opens.
not see it coming.
Into 6 right. 70.
Talk a little bit about our response. We're basically doubling down.
4 right long.
We're getting tougher
Opens.
and tougher with the Russians.
Into
That's
4
our
left
strategy.
long. 30.
And that's exactly what you'd expect if you're going to blame them, given that we're
6
incapable
right,
of blaming
opens long.
ourselves because we
Into
never do
slow.
anything wrong.
6
You all
left.
know that. All the problems in the world are caused by everybody
6 right
else,
long.
never by the
Tightens
United
turn,
States.
3 long.
Because we're a benign hegemon. Well, if we're the good guys and they're the bad
Opens,
guys, and they're
30.
misbehaving, they're bent on creating a greater
5
Russia,
right
oh my
long.
God, this is the 1930s
Opens,
all over again.
30.
Any sort of
4 right
concession
long,
to
tightens,
Putin's Munich,
50.
October 1938,
4 right
can't do
tightens.
that. So what you do is you double down.
5
You get
left.
tougher and tougher.
Very long. Tightens.
Then this
4
brings
cut.
us to the question of whether we can succeed or not. My argument is you're playing
Into
a losing
5 right of a
hand.
crest. Into 5 left
The
long.
reason you're
Caution,
playing a
don't
losing
cut of a
hand
finish. To
is
stop.
because this is a competition between economic considerations and security considerations. The basic mindset of people in the West
Did the
is that
tyres
you
perform
can
okay in that
punish
stage?
the Russians economically and they'll throw their hands up. My argument is when security considerations are at stake, when core strategic interests are at stake, and there's no question, ladies and gentlemen, in Russia's case, this is a core strategic interest, countries will suffer enormously before they throw their hands up, right? So you can inflict a lot of pain on the Russians, and they're not going to quit. And they're not going to quit because Ukraine matters to them. And by the way, Ukraine doesn't matter to us. You understand there's nobody calling for us to fight in
Stands
Ukraine.
6 left,
Even John
opens
McCain, who up until
150.
recently has never seen a war he didn't want to fight, right, is not calling for using military force in
6
Ukraine.
left. Opens 150.
What John McCain is saying is that Ukraine is not a vital strategic interest for the West. That's what he's saying.
Caution,
It
slow,
is a
don't
vital
cut, 6 left
strategic
long,
interest for the
30,
Russians.
turn
They've made
unseen,
that
hairpin
perfectly
right.
clear. And not just Putin, right? So in terms of the balance of resolve, it's all on their side. And I showed you that slide up there
120.
that depicted how much economic
6
leverage
right
the
long,
Russians have because of all that
5.
natural gas going westward.
Into 4
We're
left
playing
of
a
a crest.
losing
Jump.
hand here. But let's assume that I'm
100
wrong.
of a crest.
Let's assume that we're playing a
Left
winning
long,
hand and
and slow,
that we
keep
are
right over
capable
100,
of
turn,
backing
1
Putin
left, don't
into
cut.
a corner. And we're getting close to pushing him off a
And
cliff.
sudden,
Is this
turn
good?
4 right long,
You're talking about a country
opens
that's
of a
got
crest
thousands of nuclear
to
weapons.
crest,
And
6 left
the
of a
only
crest,
circumstance, really, under which states use nuclear weapons is when they're desperate,
into 6 right of a
when
jump,
they think their survival is at stake.
caution, keep right of a
So
crest, into
what you're
4
talking
left.
about is putting Putin in a situation where he's desperate. And if you go home and
Slow,
Google
4 right long, tightens
Putin
turn
and nuclear
1,
brinksmanship, you'll be
30.
reading all the articles that come up for the next
4
2
left
years.
of a crest,
Right?
into 4 right,
Because he's
very
making it
long,
clear
tightens,
that you're
into
fooling
cut,
around with
5 left,
his core strategic interests. And again, he's got thousands
into
of
4
nuclear
right,
weapons.
tightens of a crest,
So you're
jump,
putting yourself in a position, right? You're putting yourself in a
opens
position
the crest and 4
where
left, tightens 3,
you're
extra
willing
long,
to risk
cut of a junction,
a possible nuclear war over a piece of real estate, Ukraine, that is not
6
of
right of a
vital
crest,
strategic interest for
extra
the United
long,
States. Again,
into
it's
4
not
left of
of
a
vital
crest,
strategic interest
30.
to us. By the
6
way,
right
this is
long,
my final
over
point.
crest, jump maybe,
What's truly amazing
into
about
crest,
all of this
into 5 right,
is
extra
that we were
long,
talking about
tightens,
incorporating
keep middle of a crest, and
Ukraine
don't cut 4
into
right,
NATO
opens,
when we have now
80 of a
acknowledged by
crest,
not
and
taking
4 left
military
long,
action over
tightens 3
Ukraine
of a
that it's not a
junction,
vital strategic
50.
interest. You understand that when you incorporate Ukraine into NATO, you're giving them an Article 5 guarantee, which says you'll
6
come
left,
to their defense
extra
if they're
long.
attacked. You only give Article 5 guarantees
right
to
long,
countries that are of vital strategic
into
interest,
6 left, extra long
like
of a
Germany during the
crest,
Cold War.
opens
What
extra
were we
long,
doing? Giving an Article 5, thinking about giving an Article 5 guarantee to a country
30,
that's not a
5
vital
left long,
strategic interest.
tightens
It just
4,
shows you how discombobulated American foreign policy
into
is
4
these
left
days.
long, past
And of course,
junction,
the Ukraine
opens
crisis is
5
just
left,
one of
extra
many
long of a
messes
crest,
that we've made.
200.
As you know, we have the Midas touch in reverse. There's nothing that we do that doesn't go south. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Ukraine, I could go on.
Right of a crest, jump long, tightens,
So the point I'm making to you is, I do not think that this is going to work.
into 5 left long
But
of a crest,
if it does
40,
work,
turn
sure it's a good
unseen,
thing.
2 right long,
I had some quotes from the New York Times that really capture what we're
Opens
doing. I won't
200.
leave them up there. But
Over
they make
narrow
it very
bridge
clear that
and
we're
past
playing hardball with
Bales,
the Russians.
20, turn
Times
late,
piece
hairpin left,
Last
around
year
Bale,
that gave a good synoptic version of the Obama
Into 5
administration's
right,
thinking
extra
on how to
long.
deal with this crisis.
into
Now,
cut,
what should be
5
done?
left,
My view is we should create a neutral Ukraine, which is a buffer state between
And
NATO
6
and
right
Russia.
long, water splash,
Basically,
80,
what I'm talking about is going back to the status quo ante.
keep middle of a
Before we got
crest,
this
and
foolish
through narrow
idea in
gate,
our head that
20,
we could
cut,
peel
6
Ukraine
left,
away from Russia and make it part of NATO, make it part of the
30.
EU, make it more generally part of the West.
6 right of a crest long,
Work
80,
to create a situation where Ukraine is neutral, and it's a buffer state.
6 left,
to go
extra
back
long, tightens
my
cut 3,
Simple or simplistic graphic, depending on your
into
views.
4 right of a crest,
Right? This is how I
40.
think about European security. This is what you want. You want NATO to include
6 right
France,
of a
Germany,
crest.
and Poland. You want Ukraine
into
as a
5
buffer
left,
state, and
opens,
then you
keep
want
middle of a
Russia
crest,
on
80.
the eastern flank of that border state. And
6
this
left,
is not what
6
you
right,
want.
very
You do
long,
not want a divided
finish,
Ukraine where Western Ukraine is
To
in
stop.
NATO, Eastern
Well
Ukraine
done.
is in Russia, and the Russians and the Americans who hate
We
each
did
other
really
at that
well in
point
there.
are
Could be a
eyeball
stage
to
win.
eyeball on the Dnieper River. Not a good idea. How do you get to this end? Very simple. Explicitly abandon NATO expansion. By the way, NATO expansion is dead. I've talked to countless policymakers who say this. It's dead. But what we have to do is explicitly abandon it. Say it is not happening. We have to fashion an economic rescue plan for Ukraine that includes Russia, the IMF, and the EU. This, of course, is what Putin wanted to do in 2013, and the EU said no, foolishly. We want to go to great lengths to guarantee minority rights,
Start 6 left,
especially
opens of a
language
crest
rights
into
in
6
Ukraine.
right,
This
long
gets
of a
back
crest.
to those
Good.
maps that I was putting up that show that this is in very important ways a civil war, and what we
6
have to do
left,
is dampen
opens
down
of
the
a crest.
conflict inside Ukraine. We have to
Into
give the
6
people in
right,
eastern
long of a
Ukraine a
crest.
lot of autonomy, and we definitely have to protect minority
into
rights.
6 left,
Are we going to
6
do any of
right
this?
long,
No.
opens of a crest, 50,
I'll talk more about that
4
in a
left,
second.
into
Consequences.
don't cut 3 right
This
long
is my
of a
last slide.
crest,
Will there be a
Keep
new
right over
Cold
40,
War? No.
3 left.
Russia is not the Soviet Union, and as I said to you before, we have a potential peer competitor on the horizon who could be
Into
of
2 right,
proportion
very
we've
long,
never seen
past
before.
junction.
The Chinese threat,
Opens
once it
30.
materializes, is going to be something like we've never seen.
3 right.
We're going to have our hands
30.
full in Asia.
Cut,
Europe
4
is
left
not
over
going to
crest.
matter. And Russia is going to be with us. The balancing coalition against
Keep
China is
middle
going to
over
be South
150.
Korea, Japan,
Caution,
Vietnam,
4 left over crest, narrow.
Taiwan, Singapore, India, and Russia. The Russians will be with us. And
30.
that's another reason this whole
Keep
policy
middle of a
is so
crest.
stupid.
50.
Right? What we're effectively doing is
left.
driving the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. There's a great
And 6
strategy.
right.
We need the Russians on Iran.
30.
We need the
6
Russians on
right.
Iran.
Opens,
We
keep
drive the
middle of a crest.
Russians closer to
Into
the
keep right
Iranians.
to
You
the
saw where they
left.
just sold the Iranians S-300 anti-aircraft
150.
missiles. We need the Russians on Syria.
4
We need
right.
the Russians on all
Into
sorts of
slow.
issues. We don't
6
need to
left,
have a
30,
fight with the
turn
Russians now.
unseen, 1 right.
We don't. We're not going to have a Cold War.
Opens
Will the United
100,
States still pivot
turn
to Asia?
unseen, square
Yes.
left.
All we need is one big crisis out there. It's coming, probably in the South China Sea sooner rather than later, if you've been reading the
60.
newspapers. And once
Turn
that
one
happens,
left.
we will focus
Opens
laser-like
3 long.
on Asia, because that's a peer competitor.
Sudden
Russia is
turn
not
2
a
right,
competitor.
80.
What are the
Turn
implications
1 right
for
long
NATO?
over
This
double
gets back
junction.
to the previous question. I think that NATO is in serious trouble and will disappear as a functioning alliance
Opens
over
into
time,
6
in large
left long,
part because I think
tightens,
we're going to
turn
pivot to
hairpin
Asia.
left.
What are the implications of all this for our Asian allies? It's a very interesting question.
Opens flat over crest long,
I was in
30.
Japan in December of 2014.
6
And
left.
the Japanese, like a lot of
And
people in
turn
Asia,
4 right.
number one, wonder whether we're
40.
going to be there for them. Right?
6
Because
right over
they see
crest,
us
slow
causing
50,
trouble
turn
over
very tight
Ukraine.
hairpin left.
They see us picking a fight with ISIS. And they say if the United States is
30.
fighting ISIS, dealing with the Russians over Ukraine,
right
are they going to be
long.
able to pivot to
Opens
Asia?
90.
And then furthermore, they say, even if the United States does pivot, can we trust them?
Four
If you
left
look at how
long,
this
tightens.
gang operates in
200.
Washington, it does look like the gang that can't shoot straight. Do we want to depend on them? If you're Japanese
left
and
of a
you're
crest,
depending on the
past
American
junction,
security umbrella,
200.
especially the American nuclear umbrella, don't you scratch your head and say, can I rely on
Slow,
Washington
turn
in a
unseen,
crunch
1 right.
with the Chinese over the Senkaku or Diao Islands? Not clear. So I think this has
Into
not
left
been good
long,
for our relations
opens
with our Asian
a
allies.
crest.
What are the
Into 6
implications
left.
for Iran and Syria?
50.
As I said before, remains to be seen. We need the Russians on Iran. We need the Russians on Syria.
Jump. 4 right
And
long.
you take a stick and you poke the Russians in the eye, and you
80.
continue to poke them in the eye. They're going to look for ways to retaliate.
Crest into 6 left
And,
long.
I wouldn't be surprised
Tightens
if
4
somewhere down the road they don't play ball with us on Iran.
to keep
We
middle
don't
of
get a
jump.
deal with the Iranians.
80.
Be interesting to see what the Russians do.
Turn 3 right.
See if they're interested in maintaining the sanctions.
100. Turn unseen.
Syria is a
narrow
total
left of a
mess, as
crest
you
jump.
know, and if there's any hope of resolving
Opens
that,
long.
the Russians are going to have to be
6
involved.
left
And
over
again,
double jump.
it's going to be hard
Into
to get
cut
a lot of
5 right.
cooperation, given what's going on over Ukraine. Is Crimea
To
lost
keep
to
left
Russia
of a
for good?
crest and keep middle of a crest. 50.
gone.
Cut 6 left long.
What are the implications for
100.
Ukraine? This is in many ways the most important part of my talk, and I'll just
Keep
take
left of
2
a
or 3
crest
minutes
jump.
and then go to Q&A.
50.
When I give this
Slow,
talk,
5
many
right.
people in the West think
40.
that
Turn very tight
there's
hairpin
sort of
right.
a deep-seated immoral dimension
100.
to my position, because I'm blaming
Turn very
the
tight
West
hairpin left.
and not
Don't
Putin,
cut.
who certainly has authoritarian or thuggish
120.
tendencies. There's no question about that. But I actually
6 right.
think that what's
Opens
going
of a
on
crest.
here
50.
is that the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path.
Keep
And
middle
the
of a
end
big
result
jump.
is that
50.
Ukraine is going to get wrecked.
Crest and 6 left of a jump.
And I believe
And
the policy that I'm
keep right over
advocating,
100.
which is
80.
neutralizing
Over long
Ukraine
crest.
and then building it up economically and
Caution,
getting it out of
turn
the competition
unseen,
between
3
Russia
right.
on one side and NATO on the other side
4
is
left.
the best thing that could happen to the Ukrainians.
Opens long.
What we're doing is encouraging the Ukrainians
Into
to
5
play
right.
tough with the Russians.
50.
We're encouraging the Ukrainians to think that they will
6 right,
ultimately become part of the West,
150.
because we will ultimately defeat Putin,
4
and we
right
will
long,
ultimately
opens
get
up a
our way.
jump.
Time is on our side. And of course, the Ukrainians are playing along with this. And the Ukrainians are
6
almost
right of a
completely
dip,
unwilling
crest,
to
caution,
compromise
4 left of
with
a
the
crest.
Russians, and instead want to pursue a hardline policy.
40.
As I said to you before, if they
4
do
left.
that, the end result is that their
Open
country is going
6.
to be wrecked.
To keep right of a
What
jump.
we're doing is, in effect, encouraging that outcome.
And keep right of a
I think it
crest.
would
30.
make much more sense
Cut. 5 left.
for us to work to create
60.
a neutral Ukraine. It
6
would be
right.
in our interest to bury this crisis as
And
quickly
6
as
left.
possible.
And
It
3
certainly
right
would be in
tightens.
Russia's interest to do so. And most importantly, it would be in Ukraine's interest to put an end to
Into
the
4
crisis.
left of a crest.
Thank you.
Opens 30. Tightens. Into 4 left. Opens of a crest.
I'd be happy to take questions. I would just ask people if you would stand up and just identify
middle of a
yourself
crest
quickly.
jump.
Ma'am?
50.
Oh, you have it. Why don't we get
6
this
right
woman
long.
right here with the peach-colored coat on?
Into 6 left. Extra long.
They have a
Tightens
microphone?
3.
They have a microphone for you.
And
Opens.
there stood Hans Morgenthau, right before you.
Into 4 right.
For those
Tightens
of
a
us who...
bridge long.
Okay, so many questions.
Tightens
Points.
3.
First, point of information. When you talk about the gang
Keep right over
in
80.
Washington,
To
you
keep
need to
middle
make
of a
it
long
clear,
crest.
hopefully,
And
that
jump.
you don't mean only
80.
the present gang. You mean from at least
Keep
2008
left of a jump.
forward, right?
Into 4 right long.
Yeah, I mean the whole
Opens of a
Washington
crest.
foreign
Before this
policy
regime and,
establishment,
right.
Republicans, Democrats.
Slow
As far as I'm
30,
concerned, the
turn,
Republicans
tight
and the
heavy left.
Democrats on foreign policy are like Tweedledee and Tweedledum.
Right,
I mean, for anybody who thinks it matters whether you get Hillary Clinton or some
left of a
Republican,
crest,
you're living in a
30.
dream world. There's just
6
no
right
meaningful
long.
difference between them. They both have the Midas touch in reverse.
And keep left
Look,
of a
that
crest.
leads
50.
to my second question.
4 left of a
Is
crest.
anybody
Very long.
listening
Opens
to you and Stephen
150.
Cohen and partial, what's the one I want? The Kissinger, partial Kissinger, Stephen Cohen,
6 right.
and you. Is anybody
80.
listening that we could hope to
Turn
vote for? or
unseen.
support?
2 right.
I don't know, no one. So, and I'm gonna give this up in a moment.
No.
But, so there's no one, so we're really doomed, that's it,
5
right?
left of a
Okay.
crest. 30.
I mean, there's no enlightenment in store, we can't even
Can I
look toward
can I just say something? Just
5
in
right
response
long.
to your question.
Opens of a finish.
I believe that
Into 6 left
since
long.
1989, the United States has
To
been
stop.
by far the most powerful state on the planet. And for those of you who believe we live in a
That stage
unipolar
was
world,
tough,
you're
but it fell
effectively
fast.
saying that we are the only great power in the system. And given that tremendous amount of power that we have, we're really free to go out and do all sorts of foolish things because it doesn't blow back on us in any meaningful way. The United States is a remarkably secure great power. So we're allowed to pursue these foolish policies. And in that context, it's very hard to make arguments against the establishment that carry the day. I think what will happen
Start
if
6
China
left, extra
continues
long,
to
keep
rise
in of a crest, into
is that
6
it will
right of a
force
crest,
the
jump.
United States
Good
to
luck.
think more strategically. Because when you live in a serious threat environment,
5.
the point I'm making to you is that the United
6
States
left,
does not live
extra
in a
long.
serious threat environment. We're an
Keep
incredibly
in of a
secure
crest.
country. We're the
Into
most
6
secure
right of a
country,
crest,
the most
jump.
secure great power in the history of the world.
100
And we're more
of a
secure
crest,
today than we have
turn
ever been in
unseen,
our entire
2
history.
left.
Despite all
Opens
the rhetoric that you hear
100.
from Washington and in the media about how
6
dangerous
left,
the world is, this is just not a
160.
serious argument. It's not a dangerous world. Right? We
4
are
right,
incredibly
extra long of a
secure.
crest. 50.
We have a peer competitor. It'll force us to
Keep
focus
middle of a
the mind,
crest.
much the way happened when
Into
the
6
Soviet
left
Union was
long.
there, Nazi
Keep
Germany
in of a
was there,
crest.
Imperial
Into
Japan,
6 right.
Imperial Germany.
Really enjoyed your lecture. I have two questions
Slow
briefly.
70, turn unseen, hairpin
It's
right,
hard to take
don't
issue
cut.
with the goal
Opens
of a
of a
neutral
crest,
Ukraine,
50.
but some years before the crisis broke out, I used to listen to
Left long,
RUI, which was
30.
Radio Ukraine International on shortwave, and they were fairly open
Keep right of a big
about the
jump.
cultural crisis
80.
within the country leading back a few years before this.
Keep middle of a jump.
As
into
I
6
look
right.
at, say, the former Czechoslovakia,
Into slow. 5 left
do
long
you
of a crest,
see
tightens
a
3
possibility
over
of
very narrow
two
bridge.
neutral states formerly known as Ukraine
Into 4 left
as
long.
non-viable? And if so, why?
Opens 30.
Yeah. If you look at what happened in Europe
Opens of a
after
crest,
World War
100.
II, Yugoslavia
Of a
broke up
crest,
into a
sudden,
series of remnant
4
states.
left.
Czechoslovakia, as you pointed out, broke up into a
50.
series of remnant states.
Keep
And
left
the
of a
Soviet
jump.
Union itself
50.
broke up into a series of remnant states. And that's
6
because
left. Opens
inside of
crest,
those
into 4 right tightens.
territorial boundaries, you had different nations
5
that
left
wanted
long.
their own states.
Opens
Serbs,
50.
Croats in the case of
Caution,
Yugoslavia,
crest and
Czechs,
3 right
Slovaks
tightens.
in the case of Czechoslovakia. And we know that there were
Into
probably
don't cut. 3
15 or
left long.
16 different groups
Into 6
inside
right.
of
And
the former Soviet
6
Union.
left.
So the question is, inside Ukraine, do you have a similar situation
50.
between the people
Cut,
in the
5
east
right.
and the people in
Into
the
6
west?
left long. Of
I
a
think if
crest
you look at the
tightens.
survey data, it still shows that
30.
the clear majority of
Middle of a
Ukrainians
jump.
in both the
Into
west
5 right
and the
long.
east want to maintain
Tightens
the
4
integrity
long.
of Ukraine. They don't want to split Ukraine
Opens
in half.
50.
I
right
think
of
we
a
should
crest,
do
opens,
everything
keep
we
middle of a
can
crest,
to
into 5
maintain
left.
that attitude
Opens of a crest.
among the Ukrainian people.
Into 4 left of
My
a crest.
great fear is that as time goes by and
150.
the animosity continues to grow, that you may reach a point
4
where
left.
there is a lot of
50.
sentiment to just break Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine off from
4
each
left.
other and end up with 2 Ukraines.
Into
But I
3
don't
right.
see that happening
Caution,
now.
tightens turn.
Second and
2.
final question. As we look
3
at parts of our recent
Opens
additions
long.
to NATO, Hungary,
Stay middle
Romania,
over 200.
Bulgaria, and look at where their political systems are careening, has NATO
right,
lost
opens of a
the
big
moral
jump.
imperative for its reason
80.
being?
Well, I mean,
Middle of a jump.
what we
50.
tried to do
5
with
left of a
NATO
crest long.
expansion and with EU expansion and with
120.
democracy
Slow
promotion
turn, tight hairpin
was
right.
to
Don't cut.
turn
80.
all of Europe into one giant security community
Turn
in
unseen,
which
tight hairpin
all of
left.
the member states were
80.
liberal democracies that were hooked on capitalism and deeply embedded in these
6 left.
institutions and would
50.
therefore obey the rules that define the
6 right of
institution,
a crest
and we would
jump.
all live happily ever after.
50.
That was the goal. And I think
4 right
everybody
long,
understood
into 6
that
left long.
Western Europe looked
50.
terrific on all of those dimensions. And
Keep
what
middle
we're
of a
going to try
crest,
and do is
into 5 left.
extend these
Into 6
institutions
right of a
eastward
crest, extra long.
and
Keep middle of a crest,
consolidate
jump.
democracy in countries like Hungary and Poland. And we were going to make them
100.
look more like Western Europe
Turn
over
3
time.
left. Uphill.
We had some success
90.
and there's some
Middle of a
failures.
crest, jump.
And if you
Into
talk to
4
most
right
people
long.
who study Europe today and spend lots of time over there, they're quite
120.
pessimistic about where Europe is
Jump.
headed, not only
5 left
regarding
long.
Eastern Europe,
Opens of a jump.
also with regard to Western Europe. And I'm not sure in 25 years what it'll all look
Slow,
like.
6 right of a
I mean,
crest.
in my opinion,
extra
the
long,
biggest issue is
tightens
demographic.
into turn.
That is,
1 left.
Europeans have not been making lots of babies for a long time, and as a result, they're going to have to import lots of people.
150.
And these are countries that do not have a rich history of integrating people in a
6
smooth
left.
way, much the way the United States
Flat
does.
right of a crest.
And it's
200.
no accident, I think, that you're now beginning to see the rise of far-right parties all across Europe because of all of the immigration. So
4
one
right
could
long,
paint a pretty bleak
opens
picture about Europe's
100.
future. But the counter to that would be, we've now got all those countries, like Romania, right, like
Slow
the Czech
4 left
Republic,
long,
like
into turn
Slovakia,
unseen,
embedded in
very
these
tight hairpin right.
institutions. And these institutions will go to great lengths to combat those tendencies.
80.
And in
6
maybe
left.
a more
Opens
incremental way,
70 of a crest. Caution,
facilitate the
turns
spread
5
of
left
liberal
of a
democracy
crest.
and capitalism. We'll see whether that happens or not. But people today are nowhere near as optimistic as they were in the early
Into 6 right
1990s
long.
when it
Opens.
looked like we had the wind at
80
our
over
back
crest.
and everything was going to play
Right,
out
right,
over time
tightens turn,
in
1
favor of the West and especially
Long
in favor of the
opens.
United States. You all remember Frank Fukuyama's very famous piece, The End of
20,
History,
turn 1 left long over
which I
double
think
junction.
reflected that optimism when the Soviet Union was losing
80.
the Cold War and about to collapse. But
Turn
times
2
have
left.
changed.
Into 3 right long. 20, turn 1 right. 80, turn square right. 100.
You said, quote, we're going to have our hands full with China. And so just 2 questions. What kind of a time frame are you thinking things might start to
Turn
really
1
happen in that
left.
direction? And can you just paint a few scenarios of the sort of things that you think might happen
50.
when we have our hands full with China, so
5
we know
right.
what we can look forward to?
Into 5 left.
Yeah.
Opens over
Yeah.
crest. 80.
I think when you think about China at this point in time, there are
Cut.
3
5 right. Into 6 left over crest
situations that stand out. One is Taiwan. 2 is the South China
50
Sea,
over
which
kink.
has been in the newspaper a great
5
deal
right.
over the past few months.
Into 6
Chinese
left.
basically claim that they
And
control
keep
all
middle
the
of a
South
crest.
China Sea, and
Into
as you know, they're
caution,
building
full right
airfields
tightens.
on reefs
Opens over
in
crest.
the Spratly Islands, and we've told them
Stay
that's
middle over 1.
unacceptable, and their neighbors, the Vietnamese, the Philippines, think that's unacceptable. So the South China Sea is a potential flashpoint. Taiwan is a second flashpoint. And the third flashpoint, which was in the news earlier this year and for much of 2013 and
Into 3
2014,
left.
are those
extra
rocks
long.
in the East
Tightens
China
2.
Sea.
Past junction.
The Japanese call them the Senkaku Islands. The Chinese call them the Diao Islands.
Into 4 right.
And as I was saying to you folks before, I was in Japan
Into
in
6 left.
December of last
Opens
year,
over
December
crests.
2014.
Extra long.
And
Tightens
it's really
4.
quite amazing how worried the Japanese are about China. And
Into
part of it
6
is
right.
sort of for realpolitik
50.
reasons, but it's also because the
6
Chinese
left.
say those islands,
50.
which the Japanese consider to be sacred territory,
6 left.
really
over crest.
belong to
Extra
China.
long. Tightens
And
30.
the Japanese are greatly
over
fearful that
finish.
as China gets more powerful, it'll take those islands. So those are the
6
3
right.
main
To stop.
flashpoints at the time. There are other possible scenarios that we worry about. The
Did the
Korean
tyres perform
Peninsula
okay
is
in that
one
stage?
because the Chinese are allied with the North Koreans, we're allied with the South Koreans. China and India, they have a border conflict, so we go on and on. But those are the big 3. Now, your question about the time frame is an excellent one. I used to say that it'll take another 10, 15 years before China becomes powerful enough for this problem to manifest itself. I'm not sure about that. I think it's possible. It's not likely. I'm choosing my words carefully. I think it's
Star 6 left,
possible
opens
that
over
you could have a
crest into 6
conflict
right
involving
long
the
over
United
crest.
States and China
Good luck.
over the South China Sea or over the Senkaku/Diao Islands in the next year.
6 left. Opens over crest.
Those
Into 6 right long over
problems
crest.
are on the front burner, and it's basically a zero-sum game.
Into
I
6
mean,
left.
Either the Chinese own
And 6
the
right
Senkaku
long.
Diao
Opens over
Islands
crest.
or the Japanese
50.
do.
4 left.
So we could
Into
have trouble
don't
out
cut,
there
3 right long
much
over
sooner
crest.
than I
Keep right
have
over 40.
anticipated up to
3
now.
left.
You've
Two
talked
right,
about this
very
from the
long, past
point of view
junction.
of logical
Opens
international
30.
relations. What do you think of the internal
right.
pressures on these countries?
30.
Putin has a historically
Cut,
restive
left of a
population,
crest.
highly nationalistic, and in major economic troubles now. He may be responding to pressure from his own
150.
population to deal with this. On a
Caution.
smaller scale, we
Four
see
left of a crest,
Netanyahu responding to his population, settlers, and so on,
30.
and disrupting part of the Middle East.
middle of a
Do you see
crest.
that happening
50.
here with the radical right, say, and the neocons influencing Washington policy?
And 6 right. 30.
I think just with regard to the United States
right.
and the neoconservatives,
Opens, keep middle of a
I think the
crest.
neoconservatives
Keep right into 4 left.
have been one of the
150.
principal driving forces behind America's foolish foreign policy
4 right.
since
Into slow,
2001.
6 left 30,
But
turn
as I
unseen,
made,
1
as I
right.
said before, when I was talking about the Republican Party looking like the Democratic
Opens
Party,
100, turn
there's not a
unseen,
lot of
square
difference
left.
between the neoconservatives and the liberal imperialists. The liberal imperialists are the
60.
aggressively oriented
Turn
Democrats,
one
and the neoconservatives are
Opens
the
3
aggressively
long.
oriented Republicans. But they look a lot like
Sudden
Tweedledee,
turn 2 right,
Tweedledum.
80.
So the
Turn 1 right
neoconservatives
long with a
matter
double
for
junction.
sure, and they mattered during the George W. Bush administration because he was a Republican president. But it's not just the neoconservatives, right? And the fact is that
Opens
you have
into
a foreign
6 left
policy
long.
establishment
Tightens,
here
turn heavy
that is
left.
interested in intervening all over the world. You have a foreign policy establishment that's filled with people who believe that we have
Opens
a right
flat of a
and
crest
a
long,
responsibility to intervene all over the planet.
6 left.
That leads to unending
And turn
trouble
4
when
right.
you don't have
40.
the magic formula for winning the wars
6 right
that you
of a
get
crest,
into.
slow 50.
The problem
Turn
that we have
very
with
tight
this
heavy
interventionist
left.
foreign policy that leads to us losing all the time. It's really quite
30.
remarkable. But
Four
just
right
with
long.
regard to your point about
Opens
ideology,
30.
I think you do not want to underestimate
Four
how
right
important
long.
nationalism
Opens
is,
90.
both in the Chinese context and in the Russian
left
context.
long,
You were alluding to
tightens.
the Russian case, but let me just say a few
200.
words about the Chinese case. And this is why, getting back to this gentleman's
Flat
previous
left of a
question,
crest, past
I worry so
junction.
much now about
200.
Japan and China getting into a shooting war over the rocks in the East China
Slow,
Sea.
turn
The
unseen,
problem that
1
the
right.
Chinese face is that communism, which is the governing ideology, no longer has much
Into 5
legitimacy.
left long.
And
Opens.
they've had to
a
find a
crest.
substitute ideology.
Into 6 left.
And by almost
50.
all accounts, the substitute ideology is nationalism. And at the core of Chinese nationalism is what's known as the century of
Jump.
national
4
humiliation.
right long.
Chinese nationalism emphasizes that between
80.
roughly 1850 and 1950, that 100-year period, China
Crest.
was
Into
humiliated.
6 left long.
It was humiliated
Tightens
by the
4.
European great powers, the United States with the open door policy,
To keep middle of a
especially
jump.
by Japan.
80.
And the Chinese
Turn
are really just
3 right.
angry about this. And because nationalism
100.
is so important
Turn
to
unseen.
legitimizing
Narrow
the
4
rulers
left of a crest
in
jump.
Beijing, right?
Opens long.
This whole
6
theme
left
of
over
national
double jump.
humiliation is front
Into
and
cut.
center.
5 right.
Well, if you have a crisis over some
To
islands
keep
in
left
the
of a
East China
crest.
Sea,
Keep middle of a
and that
crest.
crisis
50.
involves
Over finish.
Japan
Cut.
mainly,
6 left long.
but
To
also
stop.
the United States. And you're talking about the two countries that have humiliated
That felt
China
good. But let's check
during
the
that
times.
100-year period. The potential for trouble is great. And I know a number of scholars in China who are quite dovish, who really worry about a crisis in the East China Sea spinning out of control because of the confluence of Chinese nationalism and Japanese nationalism, which I've not talked about. So nationalism is a very powerful force, not just in the Russian case, but in the Chinese/Japanese case as well.
Start 6 left, extra long, keep in of a crest, into 6 right of a crest, jump. Good luck. 5, 6 left, extra long.
Hi,
Keep in of a
Adam
crest,
Chekhov, actually. I just graduated
into
last
6
year.
right of a
Could you
crest,
talk a little
jump.
louder?
Sorry. Hi, I'm Adam Chekhov. I graduated last year
100
also. Thank you
over
for
crest,
signing the piece of paper
turn
that allowed for
unseen,
Molly Wen to
2
exist
left.
as someone who participated in
Opens
MUN for all 4 years.
100.
But two questions. One,
6 left,
just pretty
160.
quickly, you talked about like Russia offered Ukraine a deal involving
4 right, extra
Russia,
long of a
the EU,
crest,
the IMF,
50.
Ukraine. Can you like
Keep middle of a
lay out
crest.
specific terms of that deal and
In 2013.
yeah, in
Just 6 left long.
2013 when they offered
Keep
them the
in of a
deal?
crest.
And two,
Into
this is
6
a little
right.
more in depth.
What's the first question, though?
What were the terms of the deal exactly?
Slow 70, turn unseen.
The
heavy
terms of the
right.
deal Russia
Don't
Russia
You want me
offered
to
Ukraine.
outline the terms of the deal?
Opens of a
Yes,
crest.
if you,
50.
I don't know, honestly don't know what the terms of the
4
deal
left
were.
long.
okay. Well, then
30.
we'll just skip that one. But okay, I guess the
Right,
impression
a
that
big jump.
I've had is that like you do have
80.
several well, certainly the U.S. is trying to
Keep
back
middle of
Russia into a
jumps
corner.
into
You do have
right.
several people in Germany,
Into
especially
slow,
mostly
5
in
left long over crest,
Merkel's
tightens
coalition
3
partner,
over
the
very
SPD,
narrow
in
bridge.
their cabinet. I think Sigmar Gabriel is one who is
Into 4 left long.
pushing for like a more diplomatic
Opens
solution towards the
30.
Ukraine crisis. So, in the long term, can you see like potentially Germany, which is at this point Europe's
right
one of their
long.
most powerful states, potentially like
Opens over crest,
serving in this crisis,
100.
metaphorically speaking, as the
Yeah.
Over crest.
sort of the good cop to
Sudden.
U.S.'s bad cop, so to speak.
Left.
Yeah, this is a great question. As you all know,
50.
Germany is the most powerful
Keep left over
country
jump.
in Europe.
50.
And I showed you the
6
map
left. Opens over
where
crest.
I
Into
told
4
you that
right
Germany and
tightens.
Russia were of enormous importance for thinking
Into 5
about
left
Ukraine.
long.
So the
Opens
question is, how do the
50.
Germans think about this?
Caution crest. and 3
Initially,
right
when the
tightens.
crisis first began, after the February 22nd
Into
coup,
don't cut. 3
I
left
thought
long.
the Germans would
Into 6
prevail
right.
on the Americans
And
to
6
behave
left.
smartly and to slowly but
50.
steadily just back off
Cut.
and work
5
out
right.
some sort of deal.
Into 6 left long. Over
Very
crest
importantly,
tightens.
remember I told you about the famous April 2008 Bucharest conference? And
Middle
I
of a
told you
jump.
what was said
Into
in the
5 right
final
long.
declaration,
Tightens
that
4 long.
Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO.
Opens
Very
50.
important to understand
4 right
that
over
the
crest.
reason
Opens
that we
keep
did
middle of a
not
crest.
take
Into 5 left.
concrete steps
Opens over crest.
during the Bucharest crisis to move to include Ukraine and Georgia was because of German and French, but mainly German resistance. Angela Merkel said,
150.
bringing Ukraine and Georgia into NATO is a prescription for disaster.
4 left.
The United
50.
States, though, prevailed on getting that statement in the
4
final
left.
declaration that I read to you.
Into 3 right.
So based
Caution,
on that,
tightens
I
2,
thought
2.
the Germans would play a key
Into 3
role
left.
in tamping
Opens
down
long.
American enthusiasm
Stay
for
middle
doubling down.
Over 200.
I proved to be wrong. And if anything, Angela Merkel has
6
been
right.
a bit
Opens over
more
big jump.
aggressive towards
80.
the Russians than President
Middle of a
Obama
jump.
has.
50.
It's really
5
quite
left over crest
striking.
long.
And therefore, I don't hold out much hope
120.
for the Germans.
Slow turn. Tight hairpin right.
One
Don't
final
cut.
point I would
80.
make about this. I've actually spoken on this subject in Germany. In early March, I was
Turn
in Germany, I was
unseen,
in Frankfurt,
tight
and then I
hairpin
was in
left.
Berlin, talking to different groups.
80.
And my view of the Germans is that as a consequence of
6
World
left.
War II,
50.
the Germans don't want to be out front on any
6
issue.
right over crest
The
jump.
Germans, to put it rather crudely,
50.
are afraid to look at themselves in the mirror.
4 right long over
Right,
finish.
and the
Into
idea
6
of
left long
them
to stop.
taking the lead, it horrifies them across the entire political spectrum. So my message to the Germans when I talked to them was
That
they
stage
should
was
be more
tough,
bullshit
but it felt
when they
fast.
talk to the Americans. They should tell the Americans more emphatically that they're wrong and we should be doing this instead of that. And that line of argument gets remarkably little traction because, again, the Germans just, they don't want to get too far out front on this. So I don't see much hope that things will change. Final point I'd make on this, what I find very striking about this
Starts
whole
6 left long, 100.
situation,
Good luck.
as I was saying before, I think, Steve Cohen, Henry Kissinger, me, and there are a handful of other people, my friend Steve Walt, who've kind of been arguing the
left long,
position that I laid
100.
out for you here today, but we're
Keep
definitely
left
in
over
a
crest
minority,
jump.
a
50.
tiny minority.
Slow 5 right.
And what I find very
40,
interesting
very
is
tight
the
hairpin
extent to
right.
which the media here
100.
and the media in Europe parrot the conventional wisdom, and the extent to which
Turn
it's
very tight
very
hairpin left.
difficult
Don't cut.
for people who represent
120.
the position I've staked out
6 right.
to be heard.
Opens over crest. 50.
So in Europe, you have this situation. It's especially true in Germany. I don't read German, but just talking
Keep
to
middle of a
people when I
big
was there
jump.
about how the
50.
media is dealing with this. The conventional
Crest
wisdom
and
that I
6
laid
left
out
over
for
jump.
you is omnipresent.
Keep
in
right over
media.
180.
And
over
that
long
makes it very
crest.
hard to turn this one around.
Caution,
So I'm
turn
not
unseen,
optimistic
3 right.
that there's any chance
4
this
left.
is going to change. Our
Opens
policy
long.
is going to change, which I think is a tragedy, as I said before.
Into 5
And
right.
also, it contradicts my
50.
earlier enthusiasm about Angela Merkel, which is that you were getting.
6 right, 150.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Nell Smith,
Right
class of
long.
85,
Opens
college.
of a
Hey,
jump.
Julius. See you later. About the Bucharest directly, I have a friend that was teaching in
Two,
Russia this
6
summer
right
and
of a
said that
dip,
people were just,
a crest,
for those, I speak
cautious,
Russian and been to
4
Soviet
left of a
Union,
crest.
and then post, I mean, suddenly it's not, you're no longer a
40.
rock star now, apparently, if
4
you're
left.
American and you're on the streets of
Open
Moscow,
6.
like we're used to,
keep
people
right of
my
a
age.
jump.
She said people were coming up to her saying, "What are you doing?
And
Why you and the
right of a crest,
Germans
30.
have caused all of
Cut,
this?
5 left.
You've got all these rebels in Ukraine. You know, you
60.
organized them secretly in
6
Kiev."
right.
And it was kind of, but now listening to you, it's like
6
that's actually
left.
not
And
that
3
far
right
off. It
tightens.
sounds like. I mean, not we didn't organize them, but basically we kind of told them, "Yeah, go ahead, because we're going to help
4
you,
left of a
right?" Is that
crest. Opens
Let me make a
30.
couple points, very important points.
5
With
right
regard to my
tightens.
response to the gentleman who's directly behind
Into
you
4 left.
about nationalism, this is
Opens of a
Russian
crest.
nationalism coming to
100.
the fore. And a lot of what you see in the
Keep
American
middle of a
case is
crest jump.
American nationalism coming to
50.
the fore. You've all heard the famous
6
saying,
right long.
infamous saying, "My country, right or wrong." Right?
Into 6
And,
left, extra long.
There are just all
Tightens
sorts of
3.
Russians, you know, who are furious
Opens.
at the West, and they're rallying around Putin. One of the reasons that many
Into
people
4
think
right.
that Putin
Tightens over
started this
bridge
whole
long.
thing was
Tightens
because
3. Keep right of an 80.
it so
To keep middle of a
improved
long
his
crest
standings in the
and
polls
jump.
or with the Russian public
80.
because people behaved the way you said. So people said he started this
Keep left of a
crisis for
jump.
that reason.
Into 4
But
right long.
my point to you
Opens
is
of a
we should be
crest.
hardly surprised. And this gets back to the China-Japan example.
Slow 30,
And this is
turn,
a
tight
very
ebb in left.
scary dimension to a lot of these conflicts. But I just want to say one other thing.
80.
I've done all the
Keep left
research
of a
for a
crest,
book on the
30.
German killing machine in World War
6
II.
right long.
I know a great deal about who the Germans killed, how they
And
killed them,
keep
and so
left of a
forth and
crest,
so on.
50.
Some of you
4
here
left
have
of a
probably
crest,
taken my
very
course, War on
long.
the Nation
Opens
States, where I talk about the origins of the
150.
Holocaust, the origins of the war on the Eastern Front, killing of Soviet POWs, and so forth and so on. But my estimate
6
is
right.
that Hitler murdered,
80.
this is not killed in
Turn
combat, Hitler
unseen,
murdered 22
2
million
right.
people. And if you look at how
Opens
that war played itself out
150.
in places like
5
Ukraine,
left of a crest. 30.
there were people in Ukraine who sided with the Germans.
5 right long. Opens
The
of a
vast
finish.
majority of people, of course, fought
Into
against
6
the
left
Germans.
long.
But the
To stop.
consequences of that war are inextricably bound up with
That
what's
felt
going
good.
on
But
now.
let's check the times.
And the mere fact that there are, some reasonably small number, but nevertheless some fascists, real fascists, involved in Kiev, just spooks the Russians like you would not believe, right? And a lot of those fascists and people on the far right hate the Soviet Union for all the obvious reasons, see the Soviet Union / Russia as largely responsible for all
Starts
the
6
killing
left, 50.
that took place
Good
in
luck.
Ukraine on the part of the Soviet Union, not the Germans, right? War history coming in. So what's going on inside
left, 50.
Ukraine is
Middle of a
inextricably
crest.
bound
Into
up
5 left.
with World War II.
Into 6 right of a
And then
crest.
the
Extra
point that I
long.
tried to make
Keep
to
in of a
you,
crest
although I
jump.
didn't develop it at length, is that NATO, which is a Cold War institution, right, is
100.
inextricably bound up with the
Turn
Cold
3
War.
left.
And
Uphill.
from a Russian point of view, this military alliance moving
Middle of
up
a
to
crest,
its
jump.
doorstep,
Into
which was a
4 right
mortal
long.
foe for 45 years, is going to spook you.
120.
And if you have a coup in
Jump.
Kiev
5
and
left long.
some of
Opens
the
a
people
jump.
who come to power have fascist tendencies or are fascists, however you want to define
Slow.
that term,
6 right of a
it's going to
crest.
have really
Extra
huge
long.
consequences.
Tightens into turn.
So
1 left.
this is an incredibly messy situation. And in the context of all this, what we've done is doubled down.
150.
We do not pay much attention to history because it was not a history that concerned us in any meaningful way.
6
because
left.
It was in the eastern half of
And
the European
flank right of a
continent.
crest. 200.
Potential for trouble here is just very, very great. shut. One more? No more.
4
I
right
can't
long.
take any more questions, so you'll have to ask me afterwards. I'll answer your
100.
question afterwards. Mike told me that.
Slow 4 left long into turn unseen. Very tight up and right. 80. 6 left. Opens. 70 over crest. Caution. Turn 5 left over crest. Into 6 right long. Opens. 80 over crest. 5 right. Tightens turn 1. Long opens. 20, turn 1 left long over double junction. 80. Turn 2 left. Into 3 right long. 20, turn 1 right. 80, turn square right. 100. Turn 1 left. 50. 5 right. Into 5 left. Opens over crest. 80. Cut. 5 right. Into 6 left over crest long. 50 over kink. 5 right. Into 6 left. And keep middle of a crest. Into caution 4 right tightens. Opens over crest. Stay middle over 180. 4 right long. Into 3 left, extra long, tightens 2, past junction. Into 4 right. Into 6 left, opens over crests, extra long, tightens 4. Into 6 right, 50. 6 left, 50. 6 left over crest, extra long, tightens 30, over finish. 6 right to stop. Well done. I hope the tyres are okay.